Boris Johnson wants to secure a parliamentary majority to achieve two big goals. In the first place, he wants to leave the European Union by the end of January and then enter a transition. In the second place, he wants that transition to end by the end of December next year. Here he is today.
It's only if we can get Brexit done, only when we get Brexit done, that we as Conservatives can focus with all our hearts, all our minds, on the issues that are the priorities of the people of this country.
All this means a trade deal, future trade deal with the EU, done and dusted in 11 months. And as you were saying, Emily, Sir Ivan Rogers had this to say about a quick negotiation. This is what he told Glasgow University tonight. It runs the clock down towards the next cliff edge and confronts a desperate UK Prime Minister with a binary choice between a highly asymmetrical thin deal on its terms and no deal towards the end of next year. He then says this is basically an elephant trap that will be exploited by the EU. And recently, the EU's chief Brexit negotiator set out their approach to those talks. This is what Michel Barnier had to say about what they'll do. The trade accord we hope to discuss will be based on zero tariffs, zero quotas and zero dumping. What that basically means is stick with our standards and we can be friends. Undercut us and we won't be friends. To which Boris Johnson says, I've seen the EU play hardball with me. And then they became softies. Emily.
Nick, thanks very much indeed. Well, joining us now, the Conservative peer, Lord Peter Lilly, and Stephen Gethins, the SNP's Europe spokesman, joins us this evening from Dundee. Welcome both. The Tories are taking voters for a ride, aren't they, Lord Lilly? This is a way of trying to convince voters that a mandate for Boris Johnson in the election is a way of getting it all done. It won't be done by the end of this year.
By the end of this year, we will have a trade agreement. That is laid out in the political declaration signed by both sides, which says it is the clear intent of both parties that the agreements can come into force by the end of 2020.
It's an intent.
So
that's not a deal.
A clear intent. And they said we'll lay out a programme of negotiations that will enable us to achieve that by the end of this year.
So we have signed up. We have signed up to an intent.
And we have both signed up.
Right. And that means, as you heard Ivan Rogers say...
I mean, Ivan Rogers has made a career out of being a Cassandra ever since he lost his job. I think he told the world that Boris Johnson couldn't reach an agreement. He has.
He left to remind you because he said a trade deal would take 10 years, and that's what he's saying now.
Well, he's
his point is
wrong.
But let's look at this.
Why does he think the EU has signed up to doing it by the end of 2020? Why should we believe him and not the people who've signed and given their word?
OK, because it's very simple, isn't it? That if the UK is more attractive in terms of trade deals with the rest of the world, then it is undercutting the EU. And then it becomes very hard for the EU and the UK to have a level playing field. That's what this is all about.
No, it isn't. That's just nonsense. It's perfectly possible to have a trade deal with the EU and a trade deal with other countries. Switzerland has a trade deal with China. The EU doesn't. Switzerland has free trade with Europe. Even Iceland, with a population the size of Croydon, has a trade deal with China. The EU doesn't. It hasn't stopped it.
Fundamentally, we either want to be the same, don't we, or we want to be different. No. Now, at the moment, we are the same and we want to be different. And the more different we are, the more threat we become to the EU. So why should they sign us into a great trade deal?
They allow any country with which they have a trade deal, they have to deviate from that. Of course...
what does deviate mean? Does it mean lower our standards? Because lowering our standards...
No, it doesn't mean lowering standards. It means reaching equivalent standards by more efficient means, which don't block new entrants to a market, for example, which often is the way the EU regulates. But we want the same high standards, but we want less burden on our industry from those standards.
Less burden means cutting red tape.
No, it doesn't. That's a BBC meme, but isn't true.
Well, as Trade and Industry Secretary...
Sorry. Actually, you said cutting red tape. Yeah, cutting red tape by all means, but not cutting standards.
OK, well, let's bring in Stephen Gethins. What do you understand by this, Stephen Gethins? Maybe that's right.
No, I mean, this is yet more... It was listening to Lord Lilly taking out this old Eurosceptic or anti-European trick of attacking those who bring them bad news and denigrating Ivan Rogers himself, rather than tackling the arguments that he's made, which is it takes years for these kind of trade deals. We have the best deal possible as a member of the European Union when you have independent and sovereign states sitting around a table, making agreements and pooling their decisions. And all of this nonsense about being able to sign off a trade deal in a matter of months, it's Eurotrash.
Well, hang on a sec. It's difficult for you to argue against autonomy, isn't it? As a nationalist, this is literally about taking back control. You'll understand that.
Sorry, Emily, I disagree with you entirely. This is about isolating the United Kingdom, and as I've sat on that sofa and told you in the past, Scotland wants to pool and share our sovereignty as Ireland does and Denmark does, but as a partnership of equals. Look at the single market and look at the research and education. Incidentally, I'm here in St Andrews, for example, that benefits enormously, as do all parts of the United Kingdom. And all of this nonsense about isolating ourselves from our biggest partners. Look at Ireland, considers itself independent and sovereign, thrives as a member of the single
don't
market.
isolate us, though, do they?
Denmark's the same.
Well, a New Deal doesn't
Sorry?
isolate us at all.
Well, Brexit's going to isolate us. It isolates us from our closest partners. Look, we've built up the single market. What a huge achievement. Freedom of movement that you see people like that I've benefited from in the past. That we will be unique in Europe in taking away that opportunity from our young people. Even those that sit outside the European Union, like Norway, their young people enjoy freedom of movement and the educational and career opportunities that brings. And Lord Lilly wants to take all of those away, and he's living in cloud cuckoo land. Brexit's not going very well, and they just can't admit it. And this election is an opportunity to stop it.
You may not like what Ivan Rogers has to say, but listen to his argument, which is that as soon as Boris Johnson says we will leave and we will have the trade deal by 2020, the end of, then we are in a position of compromise. The UK gets what he calls a quick and dirty trade deal because we've already tied ourselves in. Once again, we've been so myopic that we've just tied ourselves into whatever the EU want to give us. That's where we're heading now for the next 12 months.
Both sides have tied themselves in to 2020. Both sides will be up against that deadline, just as they were against the October the 31st deadline, and that caused the EU to change dramatically in the way...
as you know. So
well, hang on. They won't get one because we've said that's going to be 2020, and they promised to deliver by 2020, so they can't renege on their words. But let's deal with Stephen Gethins' arguments.
Well, no, just
which,
deal
no,
with
hang
that,
on, let's deal with
which is to get Brexit done by the end of 2020. We are in a position of concession and compromise once again. That is fundamentally what we've done to ourselves.
Any agreement involves compromise. But the suggestion that it can't be done within 12 months is nonsense. We start where most other trade negotiations end up, with zero tariffs and identical regulations. To move from zero tariffs to zero tariffs takes 10 minutes to negotiate.
But identical regulations. Have identical regulations.
No. So the only thing you have to negotiate there, whereas with Canada they had to spend years getting. Hang on. No, listen to my arguments instead of hearing all yours, if you don't mind. You gave Steve Gethins a fair crack of the whip.
Tell me why alignment matters then.
I'm sorry. I'm going to answer the previous question before I get on to your next one. We have identical regulations. In normal trade negotiations, it takes years to get your regulations roughly equivalent. Then you have to negotiate, the one thing we'll have to negotiate, a divergence mechanism. What happens if one or other side diverges from the previous identical regulations? That exists in most trade deals. That can be negotiated in months, not years.
Let's go back to Stephen Gethin, because Ivan Rogers says alignment is irrelevant. It only matters the aim of where you want to be, not on day 1, but on day 2, 200 or 2000. It's where you end up. Stephen Gethins, is there an argument to be made that we are aligned and that gives us a huge benefit to start with?
Well, it makes it quicker.
Well, yes, we are aligned because we've got the benefits of being within the single market, and that unity of the single market has been important and critical to the economic growth that we've seen across Europe, in Scotland, across the UK and across Europe. The EU has brought peace and prosperity to Europe, and one of the main tenets of that is a single market. And look at these industries, the food and drink industry that relies on getting to these markets, where we're net recipients in terms of research and education, like fantastic medical research that goes on at our universities. We benefit from this. You're dismantling the greatest economic opportunity the UK has had, and you're replacing with something that is less good than that. You're looking at the least worst option, and frankly, that's not what we should be looking for. We should be growing our economy and building on the successes of the past, not this damaging Tory Brexit.
Well, if Stephen Gethins' arguments were correct, then for Scotland to seek independence would be madness, because they would be diverging from the market, which takes 80% of their exports. He should be very careful of using arguments which either aren't true or blow up in his face.
Thank you both very much indeed. Thanks.
Sorry, none of my arguments.
Sorry, we've run out of time. Nick.